She was in the hospital ICU with her son, while her husband enjoyed himself with his mistress. But his father found out and did something no one believed. The cold, sterile air of the pediatric intensive care unit at New York Presbyterian Hospital had become an extension of Emily's own body. It was a chill that seeped into her bones, but it paled in comparison to the ice that had formed in her chest. There, seated in an uncomfortable recliner that had become her home over the past few months, she held the tiny hand of Ethan, her 4-month-old son. Each soft beep from the heart monitor was both a torment and a blessing, a constant reminder of the fragility and strength of that small life. Ethan's body, so tiny and defenseless, was connected to a complex web of tubes and wires keeping him alive. The diagnosis, cystic fibrosis in an aggressively advanced stage, had fallen on them like a sentence. The only hope, a double lung transplant, was a high-risk procedure with astronomical costs, a mountain that seemed impossible to climb. While Emily counted her son's shallow breaths, her husband, Richard Hale, was on the other side of the city, in a parallel universe where illness and despair didn't exist. He was at the rooftop bar of the Standard High Line, with its stunning view of the Manhattan skyline. The ambient sound was soft electronic music and carefree laughter, not ICU monitors. In his arms wasn't his struggling son, but Sophia Bennett, an ambitious and stunning interior designer he'd met at a family construction firm event. Champagne bubbled in her glass as Richard handed her a small blue velvet box from Tiffany & Co. Inside, a diamond necklace sparkled under the city lights, a glittering symbol of betrayal. "To celebrate our future," he whispered, his breath warm with the scent of expensive whiskey. Sophia smiled, a smile that promised a world without complications, without hospitals, without sick children. A world where the only commitment was to pleasure and success. For Emily, the concept of the future had shrunk to the next few hours. Her life, once filled with the dreams of a young physical therapist newly married and in love, now boiled down to interpreting monitor graphs, discussing medical protocols with an exhausted team, and whispering promises into the ear of a baby who might never hear them. She remembered the beginning of it all with painful clarity. Richard Hale, heir to the powerful Hale construction, had won her over with charming persistence. He was the patient she'd treated after a skiing accident, a man whose charisma seemed to fill any room. He'd pulled her from her middle-class world in Brooklyn and inserted her into a universe of dinners at Per Se, weekends in the Hamptons, and the promise of a fairy tale love. The wedding, a lavish ceremony at a high-end venue for New York's elite, seemed to confirm she'd found her happily ever after. The first crack in that perfect facade appeared with the pregnancy. Richard, who had once spoken enthusiastically about having an heir to the Hale empire, became strangely distant. The news of Ethan's illness, received during a late morphology ultrasound, was the blow that shattered the fairy tale. Emily saw something die in her husband's eyes that day. Compassion was replaced by a cold calculation, love by veiled resentment. "We'll figure it out," he'd say, but his words were hollow, devoid of any conviction. Richard's figuring it out was to pull away, creating an impenetrable emotional barrier. The long nights at the hospital, which should have been faced together, became Emily's solitary vigil. Richard always had an excuse, an unavoidable meeting, an urgent business trip, a dinner with investors that couldn't be cancelled. The truth was that the investors had a name: Sophia Bennett. While Emily ate cold sandwiches in the hospital cafeteria, Richard and Sophia explored the tasting menu at 11 Madison Park. While Emily desperately researched experimental treatments and support groups, Richard spent fortunes on gifts and romantic getaways to Aspen. The excuse for the lack of resources for Ethan's treatment was always the same: the economic downturn, company bureaucracy, the need to maintain business liquidity. "We can't just pull millions out of the company, Emily." "That's not how it works," he'd explain with condescending patience, as if she were a child incapable of understanding the complexities of the business world. Little did she know the money existed, but it was being diverted to fund a double life, to build a future on the ashes of the family he was abandoning. Emily's loneliness was an abyss. She was in a city that, despite its millions of inhabitants, felt empty. Her parents, retired in a small town in upstate New York, offered emotional support over the phone, but they were hundreds of miles away, powerless. The Hale family, once so welcoming, now treated her with distant politeness. The matriarch, Beatrice, seemed to blame the sick grandson for her son's unhappiness. Only the patriarch, Anthony Hale, a man of few words and a piercing gaze, showed genuine concern. He called every morning, not to ask about Richard, but to check on Ethan. "How did my grandson do overnight?" he'd ask, his deep voice laden with an emotion Emily couldn't quite decipher. It was a small beacon of humanity in an ocean of indifference. On that particular night, as the diamond necklace was placed around Sophia's neck, Emily received a visit from Dr. Thompson, the head of pediatric pulmonology. His words were direct, without the veneer of optimism doctors sometimes use to soften reality. "Emily, time is running out. Ethan's lungs are collapsing. We need to put him at the top of the transplant list and start pre-op procedures immediately. This involves costs that insurance doesn't fully cover. We're talking an initial sum of nearly $1 million to secure the logistics and team." $1 million. The number echoed in Emily's mind, a dull and terrifying sound. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking, and called Richard. The call went to voicemail after the first ring. She tried again, and again. On the fourth try, he answered, his voice irritated and muffled by music in the background. "Emily, I'm in the middle of a crucial meeting. What is it?" "It's Ethan," she said, her voice choked. "The doctor says we need the money now. His time is running out, Richard." There was a pause on the other end. Emily could hear a woman's laughter in the background. "Look, I've told you I can't raise that amount overnight. The company's going through an audit. I'll see what I can do tomorrow." "Tomorrow might be too late," she shouted, her composure breaking under desperation. "I can't work miracles, Emily. You need to understand reality. Now I have to go." And he hung up. The ended call was like a physical blow. The crucial meeting was more valuable than his own son's life. The reality he wanted her to understand was that he'd made his choice, and the choice wasn't her or Ethan. It was Sophia, the champagne, the diamond necklace, and the promise of a life without the burden of a sick child. In that moment, seated beside the acrylic crib, Emily grasped the full extent of the abandonment. It wasn't just physical or emotional. It was a fundamental betrayal, a breaking of the most sacred promise a man could make. He wasn't just absent, he was actively choosing his son's death by denying him the resources to live, while squandering those same resources on his own pleasure. The ice in her chest solidified, turning the pain into a resolution as cold and hard as steel. She would fight for Ethan. Alone, if necessary. She would move heaven and earth, face the world, but she wouldn't let her son die. Little did she know that, in a mansion on the Upper East Side, an old patriarch, tormented by his own ghosts, was already moving the pieces of a chess game that would change everyone's fate, preparing a revenge that would echo from the grave. Death, when it arrives, rarely asks permission. Anthony Hale's was particularly abrupt, a seismic event that shook the foundations of the family and the empire he'd built. A massive heart attack, occurring in the silent early hours of a Tuesday, took him without farewells. The news reached Emily through a phone call from Beatrice, her mother-in-law, her voice surprisingly contained, almost formal. For Richard, the news was a shock, but one that quickly morphed into a calculation of opportunities. The grief over losing his father was overshadowed by anticipation of the inheritance. The patriarch was gone, and with him, the last obstacle to his total control over Hale Construction and its fortune valued at over $80 million. He consoled his mother, arranged the funeral with somber efficiency, and in the background already planned with Sophia the move to the Upper East Side mansion and the purchase of a private jet. His father's death for him wasn't an end, but a beginning. The beginning of the life he believed he deserved. The reading of the will was scheduled for a week after the funeral, in the imposing boardroom at Hale Construction's headquarters on Wall Street, a skyscraper that was a monument to Anthony's success. The atmosphere was heavy with solemnity. Richard was there, impeccable in an Italian linen suit, his expression of contained grief barely hiding the impatience of an heir about to take possession of his kingdom. Beside him, his mother, Beatrice, looked like a fragile porcelain statue. The company's senior directors and some distant relatives completed the circle, all expecting what they thought would be a mere formality, the transfer of power and fortune to the only son, Richard. Emily was also present. She almost didn't come, feeling her place was at Ethan's side in the hospital, but an insistent call from the family lawyer, Dr. Reynolds, a man of integrity loyal to Anthony for decades, convinced her. "Your presence is essential, Emily. It's an express request your father-in-law left." She came, bringing with her the antiseptic smell of the hospital and a weariness that seemed to have aged her soul. She sat as far from Richard as possible, a small, icy planet in a distant galaxy. Dr. Reynolds, an elderly man with white hair and shoulders bowed by the weight of corporate secrets, cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses on the tip of his nose. The silence in the room was so thick it could be cut. "We are here today to fulfill the last wishes of Mr. Anthony Hale. Before proceeding with the reading of the main document, I must inform you that an amendment was added and notarized exactly 2 weeks ago, just days before his passing." A small wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Richard frowned, a crease of irritation on his tanned forehead. An amendment? His father hadn't mentioned anything. He exchanged a quick glance with his mother, who just shrugged, equally surprised. "Doctor..." Reynolds opened the sealed envelope with a silver letter opener, the sound of tearing paper echoing like a gunshot in the silence. He unfolded the document, his eyes scanning the lines with a gravity that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "I, Anthony Hale, in full possession of my mental faculties," began the lawyer, his voice firm and resonant, "leave recorded my final decisions. Hale Construction was built with sweat, integrity, and a fundamental principle, that our legacy is not measured in concrete, but in character. A man who does not honor his own family, who does not protect his own offspring, is not worthy to lead, nor to inherit." Richard shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. That moralistic preamble sounded dangerously like the conversations his father had tried to have with him in recent months, conversations he'd always dismissed as the sentimentality of an old man. Dr. Reynolds paused dramatically, his eyes meeting Richard's over his glasses. "Therefore, after a careful and painful investigation into the conduct of my only son, I have decided to irrevocably alter the disposition of my assets." The word investigation dropped into the room like a bomb. Richard felt his blood run cold. What was he talking about? "Mr. Anthony discovered," continued the lawyer, his voice now sharp as broken glass, "that his son, Richard Hale, not only abandoned his wife and gravely ill son in their time of greatest need, but also had been systematically diverting funds from the company. Specifically, from the account provisioned for family and employee medical emergencies, a reserve that Anthony himself created to ensure no family tied to Hale suffered for lack of resources in a health crisis." Emily brought her hand to her mouth, a choked sob escaping her lips. The image of Richard with his false patience explaining the impossibility of getting money for Ethan while actually stealing from the fund meant exactly for that was a cruelty almost unimaginable. Richard's face went from tanned to a pale, cadaverous white. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Dr. Reynolds gave him no chance. He opened a separate folder, pulling out a stack of papers. The investigation, conducted by a top-tier agency, revealed a pattern of fraud and deception. We have here bank statements, corporate credit card invoices used for personal expenses of a romantic nature. He held up an invoice. Dinners costing thousands at 11 Madison Park, stays in presidential suites in Aspen, the purchase of high-value jewelry. He paused, looking directly at Richard. "All paid with money that should have been available for your son's treatment, Ethan." The silence in the room was now accusatory. The directors, once Richard's allies, now looked at him with a mix of shock and contempt. Beatrice seemed to have shrunk in her chair, her face covered by her hands. "In light of the above," said Dr. Reynolds, returning to the will, "and based on the conviction that the Hale family legacy must be one of compassion and responsibility, not selfishness and cowardice, Anthony Hale determined the following changes." He took a deep breath, as if to give weight to the words to come. Richard Hale is hereby completely disinherited from all assets, shares, properties and funds belonging to me or to Hale Construction. He will not receive a single cent. A collective gasp swept the room. Richard finally found his voice. This is absurd. It's illegal. My father was senile, manipulated. I'll contest this farce. Dr. Reynolds raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture of unquestionable authority. Your father anticipated this reaction, Richard, which brings me to the second and main provision of the will. His eyes turned to Emily, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of compassion on the lawyer's face. The entirety of Anthony Hale's inheritance, including his majority stake in Hale Construction and all his personal investments, valued at approximately $83 million, will be transferred to an irrevocable trust fund. This fund will have a single beneficiary, Ethan Hayes Hale. The resources shall be used to cover all his medical expenses, treatments, education, and well-being for the rest of his life, without any limit. You, Emily, as his mother and legal guardian, will be the exclusive administrator of this fund until Ethan reaches adulthood. The room spun around Emily. $83 million. For Ethan. It wasn't just money for the transplant. It was a lifetime of security, care, and opportunities she'd never dreamed of. It was her son's redemption, delivered by the grandfather who'd barely known him, but loved him in a way his own father couldn't. The tears she'd held back for months finally came, not from pain, but from a relief so profound it was almost painful. Richard, on the other hand, looked on the verge of collapse. He stood up, his face twisted into a mask of fury. I won't accept this. I'm his son. I built this company with him. I'll take this to court, prove he was coerced, that Emily manipulated him. I wouldn't advise that, Richard, interrupted Dr. Reynolds, his voice calm, but with a tone of final warning. Your father, in his wisdom, included an in terrorem clause, also known as a no-contest clause. It stipulates that, should any heir or interested party initiate any legal dispute to challenge the validity of this will, Hale Construction shall be immediately liquidated. The company will be sold, and 100% of the proceeds, along with all of Anthony's personal fortune, will be donated entirely to Mount Sinai Hospital for the construction of a new wing for treating pediatric pulmonary diseases. The final blow, checkmate. Richard stopped, his hand extended in a gesture of accusation, his body trembling with impotent rage. His father hadn't just disinherited him, he'd cornered him. Contesting the will wouldn't bring back the inheritance. It would only destroy the family legacy forever, annihilate the company on which the present directors and relatives depended, and mark him not just as an unworthy son, but as the destroyer of the Hale Empire. He looked around, seeking an ally, a sympathetic glance, but found only closed, judgmental faces. He was alone, humiliated before New York's business elite, stripped of his inheritance, his prestige, and his future. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Sophia. So, my love, can we celebrate yet? I can't wait to start our life. Richard looked at the screen, at the smiling photo of the woman for whom he'd bet everything, and felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. He hadn't just lost a fortune, he'd lost everything, and the fall was just beginning. Richard's exit from the Hale Construction boardroom wasn't a walk. It was a flight. He crossed the polished marble corridor, passing oil portraits of his grandfather and father, the painted eyes of the founders seeming to follow him with silent accusation. Each step echoed his humiliation. The man who'd entered that room as the presumptive heir to an $80 million empire left as a pariah, a man whose greed and cruelty had been dissected and exposed under the cold, unforgiving light of truth. He ignored the sidelong glances from employees, the sudden silence that fell in the departments he passed. The news, he knew, would spread through the company and the market like wildfire in dry grass. Upon reaching the private parking garage, his spot, once marked with a Richard Hale Vice President plaque, was already occupied by one of the director's cars. It was a small detail, but one of symbolic brutality. He no longer belonged there. In the days that followed, Richard plunged into a frenzy of denial and fury. He locked himself in Sophia's apartment, which had become a gilded cage of tension, and spent hours on the phone with New York's most expensive and aggressive lawyers. The response was invariably the same, delivered in tones ranging from cautious compassion to barely disguised irritation. "Richard, the in terrorem clause is perfectly legal and airtight," explained the fourth lawyer he consulted, a specialist in estate law. "Your father was meticulous. He used the best attorneys to draft this. Any move in court will trigger the company's sale. There's no loophole, no technicality. It's a mutually assured destruction mechanism, and you're the only one who'll be destroyed." Richard punched the exposed brick wall of Sophia's loft, the sharp pain in his knuckles a welcome relief from the suffocating ache of his impotence. He, the master of negotiations, the man who always found a way out, was trapped by his own father's posthumous genius. The humiliation, however, wasn't limited to the legal realm. It seeped into every aspect of his life, poisoning the air he breathed. The world that once revered him now turned its back. Long-time business partners, men with whom he'd played golf at the New York Country Club and closed million-dollar deals, suddenly didn't return his calls. An invitation to a charity event where he'd be honored was postponed indefinitely. His name was quietly removed from the boards of two major corporations. New York's elite, a community bound as much by wealth as by an unwritten code of conduct, had judged and condemned him. Abandoning a wife was a tolerable slip. Abandoning a sick son to die while stealing from his own family was an unforgivable violation of decorum, a stain that no amount of money could clean. And now, he didn't even have the money. His fall from prestige was a public spectacle. A discreet but devastating note in a major newspaper's society column mentioned the surprising twist in Anthony Hale's will, alluding to issues of character that led to the restructuring of the inheritance in favor of the ill grandson. It was enough to pique the press's curiosity. Soon, investigative reporters started digging. The existence of the private investigation commissioned by Anthony, whose reports were attached to the will proceedings as proof of his mental soundness, became public knowledge. Sordid details leaked, the dates of romantic getaways with Sophia coinciding with Ethan's surgeries, invoices for expensive gifts bought with medical fund money. Richard went from respected businessman to a caricature of the modern villain, the heir who let his son die. The impact on business was immediate and catastrophic. Hale Construction, now under a transitional board led by Emily and Dr. Reynolds, found itself in a delicate position. Clients and investors, while admiring Anthony's stance, were wary. Richard, in his blind fury, began spreading rumors in the market, saying the company was unstable, that a physical therapist couldn't run an empire, trying to sabotage from the outside what he couldn't take from within. It was a monumental miscalculation. The Hale board, to protect the company and Anthony's legacy, countered. They issued an official statement detailing the reasons for Richard's disinheritance, including clear mentions of financial misconduct and breach of trust. They also announced the creation of the Hale Life Foundation, a project Anthony had already outlined, which would use a percentage of the company's profits to fund treatments for children with rare diseases. The move was brilliant. It turned the crisis into a story of corporate redemption. Hale Construction was no longer the company of the rogue heir. It was the company rising on ethical principles, led by the courageous mother and visionary grandfather. The stocks, after a brief dip, stabilized and began to rise. For Richard, every report of the new Hale Construction's success was like salt in an open wound. He was formally fired from his position, his termination letter delivered by a courier. His corporate credit cards were cancelled mid-dinner with Sophia, a moment of humiliation he'd never forget. The Porsche he drove was company property and was repossessed. The apartment in the Upper West Side where he'd lived before moving to Sophia's also belonged to Hale, and he received an eviction notice. In a matter of weeks, he went from a man whose net worth was in the tens of millions to a man without a job, without a car, without a home, and with his reputation in tatters. His only possession was his arrogance, but that didn't pay the bills. He tried using his contacts to land a new job, a directorship at another construction firm. The conversations were always polite, but ended with the same phrase: "We'll review your resume and get back to you." The callback never came. No one wanted to associate their brand with the toxic name of Richard Hale. The business elite he'd so courted and felt intrinsically part of had ejected him like a foreign body. He was anathema, a walking reminder that there are transgressions money and power can't forgive. The fall was dizzying, and rock bottom still seemed distant. Sophia's loft, once a sanctuary of passion and promises, quickly turned into a silent battlefield. Where there had been laughter and the clink of champagne glasses, now hung a palpable tension, thick as the humidity in New York before a storm. Sophia Bennett was a woman who'd built her career and life on precise calculations. She was an architect of futures, both in concrete and steel and in her own. In Richard Hale, she hadn't seen just a charming man, but an investment project. He was the vehicle to the lifestyle she craved, a passport to the most exclusive circle of power and wealth. Richard's disinheritance wasn't just a setback, it was the total bankruptcy of her most crucial investment. At first, she tried to maintain the facade of a supportive partner. "We'll get through this, my love," she'd say. But her words sounded increasingly hollow, lacking the conviction she showed when selecting marble for a new project. Her gestures of affection became mechanical, her kisses a cold formality. As Richard sank into a swamp of anger and self-pity, Sophia watched, analyzed, and recalculated. She saw him spend days on the Italian leather sofa, wearing the same designer sweatpants, alternating between furious calls to lawyers and the apathetic silence of someone watching his life crumble. He was no longer the powerful, confident man who'd seduced her. He was a burden, a constant reminder of a monumental miscalculation. The shift began subtly. The late-night meetings at the design firm became more frequent. Romantic dinners at home were replaced by excuses of exhaustion and tight deadlines. Her touch, once a promise of intimacy, now evasive. Richard, immersed in his own misery, was slow to notice the ground shifting under his feet again. He clung to her like a shipwreck survivor to a piece of wood, not realizing the wood was already rotten and sinking. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday night. Richard, after another day of rejections and closed doors, tried to start a conversation about their future. "Maybe we could move out of New York, start fresh somewhere else. Miami, maybe. I could get a job as a site manager, something to rebuild," he rambled, his voice desperate for a spark of hope. Sophia, who was applying an expensive facial cream in front of the mirror, stopped and turned to him. Her expression wasn't anger or sadness, but a cold, surgical clarity. "We're not going anywhere, Richard. I'm not going anywhere. My career is here. My contacts are here. My life is here." "But what about us? Our future?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Sophia let out a short, humorless laugh. "Future? What future, Richard? The future you promised me involved a mansion on the Upper East Side, not a rented apartment in Miami. It involved being Mrs. Hale of the Hale Empire, not the wife of a resentful site manager." Each word was a precise strike, calculated to wound. "I didn't sign up for this," she continued, her tone now cutting. "I didn't compromise my own principles and ignore your son's situation to end up in a middle-class life counting pennies. I bet on you, Richard, and you, my dear, went bankrupt." The brutality of the confession left him breathless. He stared at her, seeing her for the first time not as the sophisticated, passionate woman, but as a predator who, realizing her prey had no more meat, was ready to abandon the carcass. "So that's it? The money runs out and you leave?" he spat, pain turning to venom. "Don't be naive," she retorted, turning back to the mirror as if the conversation already bored her. "This was never just about money. It was about ambition, power, the lifestyle that comes with it. You have nothing left to offer. You're a toxic name, a tainted brand. Staying by your side now would be professional and social suicide. I'm a designer, Richard. I build things. I don't cling to demolitions." That night he slept on the couch. The next morning, when he woke, his suitcases were packed by the door. A box contained the expensive gifts he'd given her, including the Tiffany diamond necklace. It wasn't a gesture of return, but a final statement. Those objects now held no value for her, as they no longer represented the future she coveted. Evicted from his last refuge, Richard found himself completely adrift. Without family financial support, and with his name burned in the market, he was forced to swallow his pride and move into a small rented studio in a modest neighborhood, paid for with the remnants of his personal savings. The Italian suits were replaced by ordinary clothes, the 18-year whiskey by cheap beer. Loneliness was his constant companion, an echo of his own choices. Months passed. Richard landed a temporary, almost humiliating job supervising a small renovation, work that in his heyday he'd have delegated to an intern. It was during this period, idly flipping through a celebrity magazine in a supplier's waiting room, that he saw the photo that sealed his isolation. It was a photo of Sophia, radiant, at a gala ball. On her arm, with his hand possessively on her waist, was an older man with grey hair and a satisfied smile, Victor Lang, one of the most notorious and successful sharks in the financial market. The caption was brief and brutal. Designer Sophia Bennett and magnate Victor Lang, the new couple on the scene, announce engagement at charity event. The engagement. The word hit him like a punch. Sophia hadn't just moved on, she'd upgraded. She'd traded him for a richer, more powerful man without the scandal he carried. She'd found her successful investment project. In that moment, seated in a plastic chair, the smell of cement and dust in the air, Richard understood the totality of his ruin. He hadn't lost just the inheritance, the prestige, and the lover. He'd lost himself. He'd become a ghost in his own life, haunted by the ruins of what could have been, completely alone in the world he'd destroyed. The fall had ended. Now only emptiness remained. While Richard's world disintegrated into a silence of dust and regret, a universe of hope and rebirth flourished under the protection of Anthony Hale's legacy. A few days after the will reading, Dr. Reynolds delivered to Emily a personal envelope, sealed with the same Hale family wax stamp. Inside was not a legal document, but a letter, written in the firm yet slightly trembling handwriting of a man confronting his own ghosts. "My dear Emily," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it is because my journey has ended, and Ethan's can finally begin in earnest, and it is imperative that you understand why." The letter was a confession, a testament of pain that spanned decades. In it, Anthony revealed the darkest chapter of his life, a secret he'd carried like an anchor in his chest. Long before Beatrice, Hale Construction, and the fortune, he'd had a first marriage, a young wife, and a daughter named Lily. The girl, like Ethan, had been born with a fragile health condition, a congenital heart disease requiring constant and expensive care. The young Anthony, ambitious and terrified by the responsibility, felt trapped. "I was a coward, Emily," he wrote. "I saw my daughter not as a blessing but as an obstacle to my dreams of greatness. And then, I did the unthinkable. I abandoned them. I convinced myself it was an act of practicality, that they'd be better off without me. It was a lie to soothe a guilty conscience. I never saw them again. Lily died at 5 and I learned of her death from a newspaper clipping a distant relative sent me. I built an empire on the foundation of that abandonment, and every brick I laid was a brick on the grave of my own humanity." The revelation hit Emily with overwhelming force. Anthony's concern for Ethan, his sad gaze, his insistence, it all made sense now. It wasn't just grandfatherly affection. It was a desperate quest for redemption. "When I saw in Richard the same fear, the same weakness, the same selfishness that defined me as a young man," the letter continued, "I knew the cycle had to be broken. Protecting Ethan wasn't just about saving my grandson. It was about saving my son's soul from committing the same unforgivable sin I did, and, perhaps selfishly, about finding some peace for mine. The money I leave for Ethan is not an inheritance, it's an apology. An apology to Lily, whom I couldn't save, and an act of faith in Ethan, who can now be saved. Use it to give him the life I stole from my first daughter. Break the cycle, Emily. Show him that the true Hale family legacy isn't what we build, but who we protect." Emily folded the letter, tears staining the paper. She wasn't just managing a fortune. She was the guardian of a posthumous act of love, the executor of a redemption that spanned generations. With unlimited resources now, the path to Ethan's recovery opened like a parted sea. Emily, transformed from desperate mother to commander of a rescue mission, mobilized the best medical team money could buy. A private jet, configured as an airborne ICU, transported Ethan and a team of specialists to Pittsburgh, home to one of the world's most advanced pediatric transplant centers. There, the wait for a compatible donor was agonizing but brief. The transplant, a 12-hour surgical marathon, was a success. When Emily saw Ethan for the first time after surgery, extubated and breathing on his own with his new lungs, the soft, regular sound of his breath was the most beautiful music she'd ever heard. It was the sound of life, pure and effortless. The following months were a miraculous recovery. Away from New York's toxic environment, in a rented house near the hospital, Emily and Ethan lived in a bubble of progress and discovery. The baby who'd spent most of his short life in a hospital bed now had energy. He learned to roll over, sit up unaided, smile with his whole body. The moment he crawled for the first time, chasing a colorful toy across the living room floor, was a victory as monumental as any skyscraper Hale Construction had ever built. And then, at 14 months, holding onto his mother's steady arms, Ethan took his first wobbly steps. Each step was a defiance of the death sentence he'd received, an affirmation of life echoing his grandfather's faith. Emily also reborn. The experience had forged her into a woman of unyielding strength and purpose. She was no longer the young physical therapist dazzled by the world of the wealthy. She was a leader, a strategist, an advocate. Upon returning to New York with a healthy, rosy-cheeked Ethan, she assumed her role on the Hale Construction Board, not as a figurehead, but as the company's moral compass. Inspired by Anthony's letter and her son's journey, she presented to the board the Hale Life Foundation project. It wouldn't just be a charity initiative, but the new heart of the company. Using a significant portion of annual profits, the foundation was created to fund high-cost treatments, provide logistical and emotional support for families with gravely ill children, and invest in research. Anthony's legacy wouldn't just protect his grandson, but thousands of other Ethans and Lilies across the country. The foundation became a resounding success, redefining Hale Construction's image and giving its work a new, profound meaning. Emily, the mother who'd fought alone in a hospital hallway, was now the hope for countless families, the living embodiment that even in the deepest darkness, the light of one life can illuminate the path for many others. 2 years passed. Time, that relentless sculptor, had chiseled new realities into everyone's lives. For Ethan, they were years of discovery. The boy who'd fought for every breath now ran through the garden of the Upper East Side mansion, his crystalline laughter echoing among the trees his grandfather had planted. He was a vibrant, curious child, with a nearly invisible scar on his chest as the only physical reminder of the battle he'd won. His lungs, a gift from an anonymous donor, filled him with life, and his eyes, the same piercing eyes as Anthony Hale, shone with precocious intelligence. He was surrounded by love, Emily's unwavering love, Beatrice's devoted affection, who'd found in her grandson the redemption she couldn't give her son, and the care of a team that had become family. For Emily, they were years of transformation. The physical therapist had given way to a visionary philanthropist. The Hale Life Foundation was now one of the country's most respected institutions for child health support. A beacon of hope for families who, like her once, found themselves lost in the labyrinth of despair. She managed Anthony's legacy with a wisdom that went beyond business, understanding that true wealth wasn't in financial statements, but in lives saved, families supported. She was living proof that a person's greatest strength lies not in avoiding the fall, but in how they rebuild after being broken. For Richard, they were years of slow-motion freefall. Silence. That had been his sentence. After the public humiliation, he'd become a ghost. The jobs he landed were menial, temporary, and he lost them invariably, corroded by a resentment that made him a bitter and unreliable employee. He lived in a studio apartment on the outskirts, a claustrophobic space that mirrored his inner life. The man who'd once commanded empires now counted coins for the subway. He saw the news about the foundation, about Emily, about Ethan's growth in magazine photos. Each image was torture, a glimpse of the paradise from which he'd been expelled by his own sins. The loneliness and anonymity forced him into brutal introspection. In the silence of his nights, without the noise of luxury, flattery, or ambition to distract him, he finally began to hear his own conscience, and what it said was terrifying. It was on a grey autumn afternoon that the past knocked on the present's door. Dr. Reynolds called Emily, his voice graver than usual. "Emily, I received an unusual contact. It's about Richard." Emily felt a chill, the mention of that name still able to evoke a shadow. "He's not asking for money or trying any legal maneuver. He's broken in every sense of the word. He requested, through a public defender, one single thing, a chance to see Ethan. He wants to ask for forgiveness." The room in Emily's office, with its panoramic view of the garden where Ethan played, suddenly felt smaller. Her first reaction was a visceral no, an animal instinct of protection. Why allow that source of pain near her son, the embodiment of purity and resilience? Beatrice, who'd overheard the conversation, was adamant. "Never. That man doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as my grandson. He made his choice long ago." But Emily, watching Ethan now trying to teach a bird to eat from his hand, remembered Anthony's letter. Break the cycle of abandonment, bitterness, resentment. Denying Richard this chance wouldn't protect Ethan. It would teach him to hate. It would perpetuate the pain. True power, she realized, wasn't in barring the door but in opening it on her own terms, showing her son that forgiveness isn't weakness, but the highest form of strength. "One time, Dr. Reynolds," she said into the phone, the decision solidifying in her voice. "One meeting, in a public place, supervised, and with one condition: he doesn't come to receive forgiveness. He comes to ask for it. Whether Ethan forgives him or not will be a decision my son makes when he's old enough and understands. Today, he'll just learn that even people who hurt us deserve a chance to apologize." The meeting was set for a reserved area in a park. Emily arrived with Ethan by the hand. The boy, now almost 3, chatted about the colors of the flowers. Then she saw him. Richard was seated on a bench, and the sight was a shock. The arrogant, impeccable man had given way to a hunched, thin, aged figure. Cheap clothes hung on his body, and his gaze, once sparkling with self-confidence, was now that of a frightened animal, heavy with the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. When his eyes met Ethan's, he faltered, as if the sight of that healthy, happy child was a light too bright for his darkness. Emily knelt beside her son. "Ethan, remember Mommy told you about your daddy? The one from the photo? He's come to see you and really wants to tell you something." Richard approached, hesitant, and knelt on the grass, putting himself at the child's level. Tears streamed freely down his face, furrowing the dust of a life of mistakes. He couldn't speak. He just looked at the boy, at the miracle he'd discarded, at the life he'd refused to save. "Hi, champ," he finally managed, his voice hoarse and choked. I'm Richard, your dad. And I've come here to tell you the most important thing in the world. I've come to ask you for forgiveness." He didn't try to justify himself, offered no excuses. He just cried, a convulsive sob, the sound of a heart finally breaking completely. Ethan, with the pure innocence of children, didn't see a monster from his story there. He saw just a sad man. He looked at Emily, who nodded with a soft smile, and then turned to Richard. He extended his little hand and touched his father's wet face. He said nothing, just touched. A simple gesture without judgment, a touch that crossed years of pain and connected the present to the past. In that touch, Richard felt the crushing weight of his failure, but also, for the first time, a tiny, fragile, and almost unbearable seed of grace. He wasn't magically absolved. His life didn't change overnight, but something in that meeting broke him in a new way, not by humiliation, but by unmerited compassion. He stood up, thanked Emily with a look containing a universe of regret, and walked away back to his life of shadows. But now there was a crack of light, the certainty that his son lived, and that in his small heart there was no hate. For the first time in years entering his dark studio, Richard didn't feel just the crushing weight of his losses, but the light and almost forgotten impulse to deserve the air he breathed. That night, he didn't open a beer. Instead, he picked up a notebook and with a trembling hand began to write. Not a business plan, not a revenge strategy, but a list. A list of steps, however small, to become a man who one day might look at his own reflection without feeling only shame. The journey would be long, lonely, and without guarantees, but for the first time, it had begun. Emily hugged Ethan tightly, the smell of grass and childhood filling her senses. She looked up at the sky, as if she could see Anthony Hale watching them. The cycle was broken. Ethan would grow up knowing that true love isn't defined by the absence of flaws, but by the capacity to face them with courage and compassion. He would grow up protected, not by walls of money, but by a fortress of unconditional love, with the certainty that he was chosen, celebrated, and loved, even when his biological father failed. Anthony Hale's true legacy wasn't in the construction company's name or the millions in the bank. It was there, in that park, in a child's hand touching a repentant father's face, in a mother's choice to teach forgiveness instead of vengeance, in the proof that the greatest of all constructions is, and always will be, the reconstruction of a human heart. And there, what did you think of this journey? On a scale of 0 to 10, what score would you give this story? Leave your comment saying from which city you're watching and subscribe to follow our next stories. Thank you so much for your company and see you next time.